Windows. I've been asked to talk about compatibilities and differences between Islamic finance, more specifically Sharia institutions, and the U.S. I think Professor Vogel's presentation was very helpful to me and hopefully to all of you in framing this subject and in understanding Islamic law and Islamic finance in more detail. I'm going to take you through sort of two prongs, if you will. The first is this discussion of Sharia institutions and U.S. laws. And the second, sort of an unrelated point, is the idea of dispute resolution, governing law, resolving differences, and so on, and that's sort of within transactions. I think it's helpful to think about Islamic finance as socially responsible or ethical investing. I usually break down Islamic finance into sort of into substantive principles and into what I call procedural principles. And this is sort of my own invention, and it's sort of a rough guide. Substantive principles speak to what you can and cannot invest in. So there are things like tobacco, alcohol, pornography. These are illicit investments. They're inappropriate targets of investment or capital, and so on. And second, the procedural principles are those principles that govern how capital is provided. There's certainly some overlap between substantive and procedural, and Professor Vogel has spoken already about the ideas of riba as well as gharar that sort of I would place into the procedural, but again they have some impact elsewhere. As the Sharia sort of addresses human activity generally, so does Islamic finance, or at least so does the Sharia go beyond mere technicalities and legalities. There is this idea, sort of central to Islam, the worship of the divine. And through that you have this notion of service to creation, service to humanity, as well as animal and plant life. And this extends beyond, talking about technicalities of interest-bearing lending to looking after the earth, looking after one's employees, being fair with one's counterparties, honesty, transparency, notion of wealth concentration, and so on. Again, I think Professor Vogel has touched on these pretty well. Now, all of this Sharia and all of Islamic finance is supposed to come under this broader rubric, the ultimate purpose, if you will, of the Sharia, which is to secure benefit and to prevent harm. Here in the U.S., Islamic finance has really two concerns. And that's sort of, I'm speaking as a matter of practice, as a matter of reality rather than as a matter of theory. First is this sort of transactional focus, and this is the notion of earning profit, but earning profit in an ethical and responsible manner. That's the first concern. The second concern of Islamic finance has been to address American Muslim needs, namely, how do I buy a house? How do I save for retirement? Where can I invest? Things of that sort. And this sort of dovetails with the bifurcation that I see in the Islamic finance market in the U.S., which is there is an organic Islamic finance that comes up from within the U.S. and from within American Muslims and the American population broadly. And there is foreign institutional and foreign investor involvement, which is perhaps the bulk of Islamic finance to date, at least on a sort of transaction-by-transaction basis. Now, all of this takes place within the existing U.S. Legal framework. That is to say, Islamic finance is not going about trying to impose Islamic law in the U.S. It's not looking to alter regulations and so on, but is working within the framework of U.S. laws and U.S. regulations, and in fact using those laws and those regulations to support the transactional activity and to support some of the purposes, some of the lesser purposes perhaps, of Islam or Islamic law. First, I will submit to you that U.S. laws and financial regulations are not wholly inconsistent with Islamic law. You're not talking about two diametrically opposed systems clashing with one another, if I can use that word. But what you're talking about is quite a bit of consistency, quite a bit of parallel, and quite a bit of ability to work together. Looking, for instance, at the notion of contract law, there's some interesting and thought-provoking research that was done by John McDesey, talking about some of the origins of trust law and contract law in sort of the Anglo-American jurisprudence that sort of took from Islamic law and Muslim legal practice. The Sharia, under at least many interpretations, has a fairly broad freedom to contract, and some interpretations give it a broader freedom to contract than that. Perhaps it's not as broad as a freedom to contract as we see in the U.S., given some of the limitations of riba and not investing in certain types of activities. But I think that's a fairly minor slice of an economy, if you will. So what you find is Islamic finance and its broad freedom to contract working within a framework that presents an even broader freedom to contract. And notions of consent and integrity of the parties and the contract are supported by U.S. law as well as Islamic law. As we start to tackle the question more directly of compatibility between Sharia institutions or Sharia finance and U.S. laws, I thought it might be helpful to start at a fairly micro level, at a fairly, what I'll call a transactional level. There aren't a whole lot of Islamic financial institutions with a physical presence here in the U.S., but there is quite a bit of transactional activity. And here I'm talking about real estate investments, private equity transactions, funds, and on the American Muslim or the organic Islamic finance side, there's this, one example would be retail mortgages or home mortgage financing. Now, most of these transactions are probably lightly regulated, or if they are heavily regulated, they fall under some exemption. And now, retail mortgages and retail products are an interesting example because they're more heavily regulated. So, for instance, you find consumer protection laws that have to be complied with by Islamic financiers or whatever institution is providing the product. But this isn't really a problem, again, because the idea of protecting the consumer, ideas of transparency, fairness, and disclosure are fundamental ones to Islamic law. Now, moving up a notch to sort of an institutional level, as I mentioned, there aren't a whole lot of Islamic financial institutions that have set up physical presence here in the U.S. But those that have, sort of their business activities, their efforts are lightly regulated at most, for the most part, and so that light level of regulation is merely sort of administrative, if you will. And those that are more heavily regulated, particularly banks, again, the question that then raises the question of can we have an Islamic bank here in the U.S.? Is it possible for an Islamic bank to function under U.S. banking regulations, federal or state or what have you? And sort of the quick answer to that we'll get into and sort of a little bit deeper, but not too much deeper, is that there are Islamic banks in the U.S. They are operating and doing a fine job at that. Now, Professor Vogel has touched upon some of the sort of more conspicuous differences between Islamic law and U.S. laws, for instance, the idea of riba. These aren't necessarily unique to Islamic law, but what I thought I would do is sort of add to what he said and talk about legal tensions rather than contradictions, because I don't really find a whole lot of contradictions when we're talking about financial law and commercial law. But as a practitioner, these are sort of the interesting points where I see. First are U.S. tax laws. Now, they don't require you to take on debt or to use debt, but there's certainly a preferential treatment given to debt and to debt instruments, and that sort of rubs with the notion that